So it is great to be back somewhere. I rarely get to do that. And I've almost never spoken at the end of proceedings like this. So I was just telling Liz, I've made a completely new talk, which I only do once every 10 years. And it is assuming that you actually know a good deal about UDL. And I know that for some of you it's still been your initial time here, but at least you've been talking about it for a few days. And I tend to be the person that starts out conferences. And so I do kind of introductory talks. So I kind of wanted to balance a little bit of knowing that there'd be some people here for whom UDL is fairly fresh, but there's people here who know a lot about it. So I decided to give a very idiosyncratic talk, and I'm going to talk about 9 things, and I'll show you what they are. So here's the topics for today. Toccata and Fugue is number 1. Shakespeare in Boston is number 2. Comprehending an fMRI, number 3. Number 4 is Matthews Clicks. Number 5, UDL goes to Harvard. Number 6, Tim Berners-Lee invents the web. Number 7, Starving B.F. Skinner's pigeons. 8, trumpet lessons. And 9, Head Start hazards. So what ties all these together? These are actually incidents in my own life, for the most part, that I'm going to reflect on from a UDL perspective. Often there are going to be things that are long prior to UDL coming along. Some are fairly recent too. But things that made a difference for me, and I'm going to recast them in the UDL guidelines as a way to kind of remind us of what's in those. So there's 9 stories, 9 guidelines. And a couple of them will be familiar if you've heard me talk before. The first one in particular, most of them I haven't talked about very much in public, so they should be new. And at the end, I'd like to talk about what we're doing at CAST going forward, sort of what's hot on our plate, and I'll show you at least one thing that we're working on that I'm pretty excited about. So the first 9 stories are retrospective. Some parts I'm looking back at things, lessons I've learned or lessons I should have learned. And I'm going to assume that you at least know 3 principles: multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, and there's 3 guidelines within each of those, and I'm going to use my stories and anchor them in those guidelines. All right? This is the one that some of you will have heard. I believe I used it here at Towson when I was here last, and it's one of the more recent things, but I like to start with music in any case. So I won't do my whole shtick on it, but some of you have heard me play the Toccata and Fugue in D minor from Bach. And let me just, since it's lunch, I'm going to open up just to start playing it right in the middle and see if you can comprehend this piece. Okay, now if you're like most people, myself included, you don't really know what's happening in this piece. And if I were to say to you, write a 5-paragraph essay on what Bach's doing here, you would probably fail the essay, as would I. If I gave a different representation of this, for some of you, that would clarify what Bach's doing. So this is a traditional notation. And those of you that studied music would be able to quickly grasp, oh, I see what Bach's doing here. Most of you probably still, this representation wouldn't be helpful enough. And here's a representation that is a multiple representation, that now a crazy guy started doing these 10 or 15 years ago, and nobody knew he was doing it until the web got developed, and then he became famous. So here's that same piece in a multiple representation. Okay, just about 30 seconds. I want you to watch this next figure, which is hard to hear what he's doing and easy to see what he's doing. Okay, so that's a multiple representation. I now listen, when I'm going to symphony even, I listen to the pieces this way, that is visually as well as auditorily, because there is such a rich way to understand the music. And a couple things I want to say about it. One is, it doesn't detract from your enjoyment of music to know more about it. It actually makes it richer and stronger. And the reason I wanted to begin with this story is to tell the backstory that I'm not sure I've told here anyway, that this, of course, makes music accessible, this particular piece and many pieces, he's got like hundreds now, it's typically thought, well, that would make music easier to understand for people who don't understand music very well. But I wanted to tell the backstory of, I went to New York City. I have a friend who's a composer and teaches organ music, actually, at Queens College. And I told him about these. He hadn't seen them. And I said, gee, I'd love to show you one of these visualizations of Bach, and many other things, but I said of the Bach. And I have the Toccata and Fugue, and Bach's Toccata and Fugue. Would you like to see it? And he said, not really. He said, I've played it 100 times. I know it really well. I teach it. No thanks. Luckily, his teenage daughter was with him, and she said, Dad, why don't you just listen to it, huh? So we put it on their TV, and I played it. And what happened was that he, at first, looked diffident, like, who cares? And as it went on, the sheer beauty of it and the sheer clarity of it grabbed him, and he started really staring at it, and ended up on Not Doing For You. He played the whole piece, watching it on his television and listening to it. And at the end, he said, wow, there were parts in there that I never understood before. So the reason I wanted to start there is because the lesson I want to draw out of that is UDL is sometimes misinterpreted as something you do for kids with disabilities or struggling learners or something like that. What was cool about that incident for me was that this is a good enough representation that even an expert, someone who teaches everybody this all the time, found more to learn in it because of the way the stuff was represented really well. And just, some of you have not seen me do this, so I just want to show one other segment, which is the beginning of the fugue. Look how beautiful it is, by the way, to go through the music. You can find the part you want by looking at it visually. It's easier, actually, than auditorily. That's the whole toccata. And now we're going to start the fugue. And some of you, I'm just going to tell you what a fugue is, because you may not know. Background knowledge, we'll talk about it later. A fugue is a piece of music that has a single theme, and the theme is very short, and it's played again and again in something that feels like a chase, chasing after itself. But each time it's played, it's in a different context, which is sort of a UDL thing all by itself. So it hears and feels different, because it's never quite the same, even though the theme itself is perfectly the same, that it's put in a different backgrounds, put in a different context, so you hear it differently. So I'm going to show you the theme, so you can see it coming. This is the end. There's the theme. See it in blue? That's the first time the theme comes, and right away, it will be played again in yellow. Can you see how it's exactly the same? Okay. Now, let me just play this, and we'll watch that theme get developed. There it is. Higher it looks, the higher is the voice. Now the two of them just dance a little. Now here comes again, you can see it coming, very high. Now Bach does an educational thing. He plays the beginning again and again. He says, I want you to remember this. 4 straight times, 5 times. I think Bach was an educator. He says, okay, I'm going to give you a little help here. I want you to be able to hear that when it comes. Okay, I'm just going to do one more. Watch it. This one's really hard to hear, but easy to see. Way down deep in the bass. Okay, visually you can see it coming and you can follow it, and he's playing the pedals to do it. So as the piece gets on, you're playing those themes against each other even, and sometimes at Bach, and that's what my musicologist went, wow, right in the middle, Bach turns it upside down, plays the theme upside down and backwards. And you never noticed that in the score, and didn't notice that with his fingers, and things like that. So anyway, the theme is there about 40 times. And in this way, you can actually understand what Bach's doing, but you see the beauty of what Bach is doing by putting the same theme in lots of different contexts, and sounds different each time. Okay, so that's a multiple representation. Really well done. It helps people who are struggling as learners, you and me. We get to understand a piece better, stronger, but also for people who are not struggling, people who are very strong, like the musicologist, for whom there's more stuff to learn here. So one of the dangers I want to say is avoid thinking that what you're trying to do is to make things simpler or easier. That's not usually a good approach. What you want to do is make them deeper and richer so that they're entry points for people who are beginning, but also stretches for people who are very far along. That's what UDL should look like. Okay? Where's my little... we're going to work up the guidelines a little bit. And I realize this is not going to be bright enough. So that's an option for perception. And some of you have sheets I see in front of you. That'd be great if you took them out, because you'd be able to follow along. And what it does is talks about how can we make sure everybody can perceive this music and what's happening here by using color, by using where the music is on the scale, all of those things, making it visual. And it does a lot of the options that are talked about in the guidelines. Alternatives for visual information and auditory information. It gives them both. So let's present it both visually and auditorily. And it allows you to actually customize the display, which I didn't show, but you can make the display right for you. So actually it really does a nice job of doing, let's make sure that the theme is perceptible to everybody, which is still a long way from understanding the piece, but let's make sure everybody can perceive it. Okay? Next I'm going to go to providing options for language, mathematical expressions, and symbols. And this I'm calling Shakespeare in Boston. And this is from my own teaching, my first full year of teaching where I was in charge of all the students, long past practice teaching. And in fact, I want to tell you a little bit more of the story than I usually tell, because the story actually was pivotal in my life in many ways. I applied to teach in the Boston Public Schools because I wanted to teach in inner city schools, and I was very invested in the idea that education could be an equalizer. It could decrease achievement gaps. It could make for a more equitable, just society. That's what I wanted to do. So I chose an inner city school system, Boston, to come to teach to. But in my master's and undergrad, I'd done a bunch of things. So I looked good on paper. And I had good references from my practice teaching. So when I applied to Boston, this is sort of shocking that they used to do this, but they would rank all of the incoming teachers, literally 1 through how many there were. And that year, 754, I think, teachers applied to teach in Boston. And they ranked us 1 through 754. Now again, I look better on paper than I actually am, but I came out number 2 out of the 754. I mean, these are obviously mostly incoming new teachers. So they thought I was the second best out of nearly 800 teachers that they were going to get that year. And so they offered me the job, and in my letter, I said, I'm so happy, and I want to be placed in the toughest school you know, one of the toughest schools you have. That's what I really came for, and that's what I'm looking for. So here's what I want to say. As an administrator, here you have this young puppy, and maybe he's going to burn out. But anyway, you think he's good. He wants to teach in a really tough place where you're having a hard time getting good teachers and so on. Wouldn't it be a good idea to place him there? Stick him somewhere hard and make him earn his spurs. So you know what they did? They assigned me to Boston Latin, which is the exam school, which is only for bright kids in Boston. You have to take an exam even to get in it. So they did the exact opposite of what I was trained to do and what I wanted to do and what I think the school system would have needed. So they put me in the best school possible where everybody was going to go to Ivy League schools anyway. So I had to actually petition. And I went in quite angrily because I'd driven all across the country to get there and everything. And it's like schools now too. They only told me 3 days ahead that I was going to be at Boston Latin. So I had to petition to get out of Boston Latin, which caused a furor because they were, you know, there was a plum. Anyway, and they assigned me, almost in spite, to an annex of Boston English, which was actually a really pretty good school. But they opened an annex in a trailer out in Roxbury. And they assigned me there. And I think it was their way of saying, okay, you want rough, you're going to get rough. You're not even going to be in the school building. So I had a pretty rough start. The curriculum called for me to teach, these are sophomores, all boys. All boys, because at that time the schools were segregated by gender, which is a whole nother story. But anyway, so I'm teaching all sophomore boys. And they are basically reading at a second and third grade level at best. I don't have anybody reading anywhere near grade level. And I have some essentially non-readers. And I look at my curriculum, and I'm supposed to do Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet specifically, and I'm thinking, holy cow, what am I going to do about Shakespeare? I didn't know anything about UDL at the time, of course, but I did care about Shakespeare. I'd taken a good Shakespeare course, and I thought Shakespeare was cool, and I thought the kids would think it was cool, but the vehicle we had for learning about Shakespeare, reading Shakespeare in their textbook, was clearly not going to work. So here's what I did at the time. I actually began to have a recording. I brought, it was, some of you are old enough to know, a 78 RPM record, which I would bring every day, and I would have one of the students was running the record player, and we would play a scene and follow it along with our fingers in the textbook. I had absolutely no people who could read that text independently. So we would follow along. And of course it was very animated. It was good acting, Royal Shakespeare Company and stuff. And then we'd stop and talk about it. And sometimes I'd give them stuff ahead so that they could think about it and so on. And you know what happened? They really liked Shakespeare. They got into Shakespeare. And I did too. I enjoyed Shakespeare more than I ever had, because we really got into, like some of you know, Romeo and Juliet. There's these great scenes at the beginning where insults are traded between the rival gangs. And those insults are these wonderful puns and, you know, incredibly bad language and smutty and everything. And, and once I explained that stuff to the kids, of course, they're, wow, these guys are swearing at each other and making it sound good. This is cool. So we got into what playing the dozens is and what language can do and all that kind of stuff. We got into Shakespeare, we got into language, we got into all sorts of things. And I loved it. And I think they actually really enjoyed Shakespeare by the end. Then I went one step too far. At that exact year, Franco Zeffirelli's film called Romeo and Juliet came out, and I see several people nodding. How many people have seen Franco Zeffirelli's? Wow, a lot of people. Holy cow. It's good, right? It's like the best, it's fabulous. Anyway, there's only one thing bad about it, which for sophomore boys will become clear. So the film is done with actual people who look 15. I think they were 15, right? I forget the actors. Were very young, which is appropriate to the play. And the woman was gorgeous, and the man was handsome as could be. Young kids, teenagers. Anyway, they have a love scene. And in the love scene, unknown to me, of course, oh, sorry, I've had to hire a bus and bring 125 randy sophomore boys to the local theater. And they know the play and all that, so this is going to, and the theater is shut down, so we're the only people there. But anyway, can anyone remember the actress? She was fat. Olivia Hussey. She was gorgeous. Anyway, Olivia Hussey's in bed with Romeo. She turns over, and out flops a bare breast. And 119 of my 125 boys shouted out like, "Wah!" Like, it's just like too much for English class. And that caught their attention, I will say. And then I had to, on the bus, had to have everybody swear that they would not tell their parents that they had seen Olivia Hussey's breasts in my class. I made them all promise, or that I would quit, or I'd be fired, one or the other. Anyway, so nobody, what's the word? Nobody telltaled on me, and we survived the year. But it began a trust of that, I would do anything to get them to Shakespeare. We listened to it, we did it together. I never let them alone to experience failure, and we could enjoy it and see a movie and talk about it and whatever. And it spilled over into everything. They became interested in poetry. They became interested in writing because they got a sense of what Shakespeare was doing. It was fabulous. And this is a story I almost never tell, but it's the end of this story. So we actually made which is a UDL part 2, we began to make a poetry and art magazine because we're a great art teacher in the same annex. And we made a really, the kids wrote poems and illustrated them, and they usually paired up. So we had art and writing. And we published it and handed it out to the kids, and they liked it. And the kids were authors. And then I got a call from the head of the English department. And I almost never went to the English department because it was a frightening place. And I was in the annex so I could escape it. And I came into his office, and I saw that he had our poetry magazine on his desk. And I thought, cool. He's going to tell me I'm doing a good job. I could go for this. So what he did instead was he picked up the magazine, held it in front of me, and he said, and this is literally what he said, "What made you think your kids wrote these poems?" And my heart sank. Because a lot of you have since studied the Rosenthal effect, which is the tyranny of low expectations. If the school has low expectations for you, you're going to get low results. And so here was the head of the English department who did not believe that my students wrote their own poems. I don't know what he thought about the art. And I just stared at him and I thought, holy cow, you are the problem. We're not going to get there if we have you. So this is an honest to God story. My wife will confirm it. That I was so upset by the whole experience. He also, by the way, during that meeting, called the African American students jungle bunnies. It was just a horrendous meeting for me. I was just like overwhelmed with it. And he didn't believe in my students, and he was just incredible racist about many of them. So I was just horrified. Anyway, so I went home very angry. And I applied to the Harvard Graduate School of Education that night. And I just want to be clear that I did not apply to Harvard thinking I was going to do any big good thing. I only applied because I wanted to get a degree that would allow me to come back to that high school and fire that guy. That was my entire motivation for going to graduate school. I figured if I get a doctorate from Harvard, I'm going to apply to be his boss, and I'm going to, on the first day, I'm going to bring him in, and I'm going to say, Low expectations about your survival here. But anyway, I got distracted at graduate school, and I didn't go back and fire him. And I think he was fired by the time I left. But anyway, so it was actually the first time that I played with what became Guideline 2, which is on your sheets, options for language, expressions, and symbols. That is, my kids couldn't get to Shakespeare because they couldn't do the decoding part. So in here, it says, provide options for decoding, provide options for vocabulary. So I told the kids, what do these words mean? And I would help them. I didn't make them make it some big puzzle. And so on. A bunch of things are in here that we worked on. And we worked on even the syntax. How did Shakespeare make a joke out of this? And so on. So I provided options. Indeed, we listened to it rather than read it. But the clear thing is, I was after very high goals, which was that they could converse and think about Shakespeare and understand the art that was Shakespeare. And I think they actually did that. So, Guideline 2, provide options for language. Language is often a barrier. For decoding is another barrier. Vocabulary, all of those are barriers for some of your students. But there are options we can do now. You don't have to play a 78 RPM record. It's built into the technologies we all have. Every laptop speaks itself. Every word, a lot of people don't know it, but every time you write a word in Word, you can ask it to read it back to you. Everything you've typed, or every time you take something, it'll just read it to you. So nobody has to be a great decoder to get to Shakespeare anymore. Okay. Third guideline, options for comprehension. What are the options there? And this is actually a new thing. Some of you know I like to talk, my background's in, I went on to study neuroscience. This study knocked me out. And so I just want to tell you about it. Some of you, well, some of you know that I like to look at the neuroscience of things like reading. So this is a gorgeous study that came out, I think 2 years ago. And it's dramatically changes the way you think about reading, if you look at it right. Okay? So let me show you what's happening here. What's happening is a kid is reading. These are high school kids. They're reading, and they're in an fMRI machine. All right? So their brain is being scanned while they're reading. And the colors are attached to specific parts of what they're reading. That is, someone's gone through the thing they're reading. I can't remember what it was. I think it was fiction. And they coded the sentences red if it was about the character. If it was about the character's goals, they coded it light green. If it was about an object, like describing something in the room or something, they coded that green. Space, if it was about space, talking about the outdoors or stuff, that was blue. You can see that. Okay, so they just went through and said, what is this passage about? What are the parts about? And then they looked to see what part of the brain lit up. And I think you know this terminology. When I say light up, it means what part becomes active? What part starts to really burn glucose is what's happening. And here's what happens, is that you can see that when the student is literally reading about character, this part of the brain lights up. And you know what's there? This is the part of the brain that you recognize people on the street with. You recognize your friends and enemies and all those. This is the part of your brain you do that with. So they went, oh my God, when they're reading about characters, they're visualizing them, but they're using the same exact cortex they use when they see people. You know what they're doing? They're running a simulation. And you, when you see a person, you actually run a simulation. You say, oh, I remember, this is Bill. You run that simulation right here, so you can say, ah, I know, I recognize him as Bill. But when you read, you run simulations in your head. You imagine the character. And you go ahead and you do that simulation right with visual cortex that you recognize people with. Isn't that interesting? And they found out the same for objects. Objects are down here. Huh? That's what lit up when they were looking at objects. And they were talking, when the thing was about the goal, he was striving to become a senator or something. Then way up here would light up. Prefrontal cortex, where you're setting goals for yourself. So they went, oh my God, the kids are simulating goals in their head when they're reading. They're running a simulation, and that's the way we read. And you use your whole brain to do it. look here. You can't see many parts. This is only one passage. You can hardly see any parts of the brain that aren't lighting up. So when someone says to you that reading has like two parts, decoding and often decoding vocabulary and reading comprehension, language comprehension, say to them, ixnay on that. Way more things go into reading than two things, than four things, than six things. There's not two pillars to reading. There are literally hundreds of pillars to reading. And what this shows you, which you know as good teachers, is there are a lot of reasons why some students have trouble with reading, not one or two. And one of them is, if you've never seen, and they now have done this experiment, if you've never seen a ballet dancer and you read the word ballet dancer, you can't imagine it. You don't have a simulation for that. So what happens? You can't comprehend it. You're not able to run that simulation. And a lot of your students and mine don't have good background knowledge. They can't run good simulations because they don't know that stuff. So they have comprehension failures that have nothing to do with decoding. They have nothing to do with simple vocabulary. They have to do with what kind of background experience they've had. What can they bring to their reading? All right? There's lots of other parts of the brain. This part's, because some of you have heard me talk before, you also, when you read emotionally. You are always coding, how do I feel about this? And so these parts of the brain are the limbic systems, the emotional parts of your brain. So good readers are feeling emotion when they read. Even if they hate it, they feel the emotion of hating it. Bad readers don't feel those emotions because they're not really, they're not engaged deeply enough in the text, they're not comprehending it, so they're not feeling anything unless they're being exposed as a bad reader, in which case they start to feel dread, they start to feel threat. Okay, but it has nothing to do with the reading, it has to do with their how they perceive their own abilities. Okay, so comprehension, reading comprehension, I just wanted, this is one of the stories I wanted to say from the neurosciences, which from time to time will just knock me off my chair and go, wow, this is a good way to think about what reading really is. And it's much richer and smarter. And then it made me think, you know what? I was helping my high school students in Boston run good simulations. They didn't know Elizabethan language. They didn't know a lot of meanings in that. They didn't know how to decode. But I gave them a rich enough experience to simulate in their heads Shakespearean culture, Elizabethan culture, and to really understand. Okay? Now, I'm trying to read the audience a little bit. Some people look interested, and some people are, doing their emails and stuff. So it scares me when you're doing email, because I've never given this talk, and this could be a complete disaster. So you have to look up, even if it's not going well, give me a signal that it's not going well, because then I can adapt a little bit. But I need a special, not be staring at your machines, because I don't get enough feedback that way. Okay? All right.
Raise your hand if you're taking awesome notes on everything David's saying.
Oh. Oh, she's got a brain app. Okay, good. You're going out to other resources. Actually, how am I doing on time? Oh, I'm doing okay. This is a great example. I once got myself in trouble I was giving a lecture like this in Chicago. And there was a person sitting right up front to me. And he was completely not paying any attention to me, typing the whole time. And I am incredibly egocentric, as you can tell, and it was just so bothersome to have a person who's not paying any attention to me. And I'm staring at him, trying to get his attention, like, please, they've spent a lot of money to get me here. Will you just at least listen to a little bit? Never looked up at me, stared straight in his computer. So I've never done this before, but I was thinking of going out and checking in with a couple of you guys at the break, just that some people haven't looked at me yet. So I was thinking the same thing. Anyway, so I went up to him, and I said, this doesn't seem to be working for you. What's wrong? What can I do? And he said, oh, no. He said, I'm totally enjoying this. He said, I'm very ADHD, and if I just sit there and try to listen, I can't do it. So I type everything, and that keeps me focused. And then I felt completely embarrassed, because in fact, he was doing a UDL approach where he said, this is the way I listen. This is a good way to listen. So he said, get up on the stage and do your thing. I am listening the way I should listen. So anyway, so that's when Liz said, are you typing? So some of you I'm misinterpreting as not paying attention, and you're really paying attention in your way. Fabulous. Okay. Now I'm going to move away from that to the principle about action and expression. And we want kids who are strategic, goal-directed, executive kids. To get there are 3 guidelines. Make sure that everybody can physically act, because they aren't going to be able to be strategic if they can't even act. Secondly, provide options for the ways in which they can express what they know. If we provide only one, they're not going to be able to do well. And thirdly, provide options for executive functions. So I want to work through those just a little bit with some stories. This is a recently recovered film from the very pivotal moment when CAST was born. If there was ever a moment when CAST was born, this was it. So the video, we just went through some old videos, because Ann Meyer, who's the woman in the screen, one of the co-founders of CAST, she had a retirement party, and we scoured, to get some old videos. So this is, many of you have heard me talk about Matthew, who was the pivotal kid because he's very physically disabled. And he came to, we were clinicians then, CAST wasn't a thing yet. And we saw kids who were having trouble in school. And Matthew was brought in by his mother because he was so physically disabled that the school system was going to send him to an institutional school. They're going to spend a fortune, $100,000 tuition to go to a school where he's essentially going to be warehoused. And why? Because Matthew actually has what's called locked-in syndrome. He could only move his eyes and his chin. So he couldn't walk or talk or point or smile or sit up or anything like that. Physically immobile except for his chin and his eyes. So everybody assumed he was profoundly retarded. I'm using the negative word because that's the word that was applied at that time. But his mother just felt there's more there than people are seeing. So she brought him in to us to evaluate. And we are, right now, you're going to see, and some of you like George has heard me talk about Matthew many times, but this is actually Matthew's first time with a switch. This is a moment. So we made a switch for Matthew. We hadn't attached it to anything yet. But we wanted to see, could he learn how to use a switch with his chin? Because it was one thing he could do. He couldn't talk or point or anything like that. Couldn't even smile in the same way everybody else smiles. You'll see a smile in a minute that's his smile. But anyway, and Ann is holding up the switch under his chin, and she's trying to get him to do dit-da, which is the first letter in Morse. I don't know what letter it is. I've forgotten. We all learned Morse code at the time. But anyway, so Matthew's going to do Morse code, we hope. So Ann is holding the switch to him, and she's trying to get him to do it. And you'll notice when you see her sweatshirt, she has Morse code on her sweatshirt. It's like a word wall that we all wore sweatshirts when Matthew would come with our names in Morse code. So he would see, like you do as good teachers, so he'd see a lot of words in Morse code. So you'll see that's Ann's name in Morse code is what the dit-das are. Okay, so here is actually Matt's first success in communicating in any way. And this is a switch obviously attached up to a computer. And here it goes.
Okay, wait a minute. Good, now long. Short, long. Okay, sorry, next. Then long. Good. You know what happened when it was too long pause? Matthew, this is hard work. You are doing great. You did it. You did it. That's right. Matt, hold it.
Watch what Ann does. Watch Ann. A little emotion from Ann, too. We all went, oh, my God. And then he was off. He learned Morse code in a week. And he came back in and he was communicating with us. So we could see, whoa, you could do dramatic things. I'm so glad we have that moment. We need to provide options because no one would have known without that clicker that Matthew was a bright guy. Actually had a completely normal IQ when we later tested him. And he's now in community college. And he's a grown-up kid. Yeah, it's fabulous. The only thing he's concerned about now, he's not getting enough dates. You know, it's like he's a normal guy. I said, I have the same problem, you know, when I was in community college. Okay, so any rate, the first guideline is to make sure, and not many of your students have this problem, obviously, but provide options for physical action. Make sure everybody can do this so that you're not unfairly and stupidly misinterpreting their inability to act as an inability of intelligence or motivation or stuff. By the way, all kids with disabilities are called unmotivated. It's so interesting. You've seen this with kids with LD. Oh, they just don't try. But actually, people thought Matthew didn't try. He's so physically disabled. There are only 2 things he can do. But people were saying, you're not trying. You're thinking, are you crazy? Okay, didn't have good access tools. All right. Let's see, am I in the right place? Okay, yes. UDL comes to Harvard. So this is me teaching my class at Harvard. And when I was here last, I did speak about changes in my own course, that I had to make my own course UDL because the students were ticked off that I taught so poorly. This is what my class looked like. It's changed rather dramatically, but it used to be like 100 graduate students, and they're all sitting in rows and they're mildly paying attention. The part I talked about last time I was here, I just now want to downplay and say, that's like stupid stuff. But it was what I did first, among a bunch of things. But anyway, just to show the difference what I want to do now. You know the phenomena of having note takers for students with disabilities in colleges and stuff. Okay, provide note takers. Expensive and doesn't work well. So I came up with the idea of having a distributed note takers. That is, everybody takes notes. But what I would do is just divide up the class, and every night we had class, 5 people were responsible for taking notes. And then they posted them on the web. So, in fact, you could do it. I think Liz was asking. We could all do that every time we do it. Just say, well, so you don't all have to take notes. Let's have 5 people take notes. And then you'll all have them. Okay? And so all my Harvard classes are like that now. 5 people take notes. So you may say, why do you need 5? And I want to show you why you need 5. So anyway, I'm not going to show you all 5, but here's one of them that I show because it's funny. So here's his lecture notes, and he writes it incredibly personally. Some people write just totally linear outline notes. They look like they came right out of English class. But he's like a different kind of guy. So he says, hi, my name's Chris. In case you missed it or simply want to relive it, here's what happened on Tuesday night. That's class. But then I'm not quite in the class yet, and he's kind of egocentric guy. So he says, I am wearing a blue shirt. There he is. He puts himself in the notes. It's from the state of New Jersey, Department of blah, blah, blah. I'm also wearing jeans and new boots. Dr. Rose enters the room at 7:02 p.m., late as usual. And he says who he's sitting next, and she tried. Anyway, he tells this whole story, dog and pony. Whoops, I didn't clip it all. Anyway, he aggravated me, though, because he's sitting right here. This is his picture. That's his bottle of drink. He started to take pictures while I was talking, and that annoyed me, too. I was like, you know, I'm doing this. I worked hard to make this lecture, and he's snapping pictures. But all the pictures are now here in his notes, and he took pictures. When I did put things up on the board, he just took pictures, like is more common now, but it was kind of uncommon, and this is 2006. And then he started, you know, took out a little video, and he was taking things that were important. When I'd say, now there's 3 important points in this lecture. So he'd go and take them, and then he slapped them in the notes. And everybody later said, wow, his notes are good, Chris's notes. And then, so what happens is then it kind of has this contagion where not everybody likes Chris's notes, but enough people like them that they go, those notes work for me. I like the personal touch, I like the pictures, I like a few videos thrown in. And what happens is people realize, well, there's a bunch of ways to take notes. And by the end of the class, the notes are rich, they're wonderful, and they're all different. They're so different. Now, I maybe should have shown a few more. I didn't want to clip them all out. But if we have time at the end, I can show you. You wouldn't think they're in the same class. Some are entirely visual. Some are tight little outlines. Some right on the slides I use. I mean, it's just amazing how inventive people can be. So it is, in fact, a multiple means of expression. When I say, take notes. But let's have at least 5 people because nobody's notes are going to be perfect for you. And what happens is students find, I like to read Chris's, and then I read Sally's, because Sally's are so different. And then between the 2 of them, I usually get a pretty good idea what happened. Isn't that cool? They're all posted on the web. If they're not posted on the web, it's no use to anybody. But they're all posted so they can go, okay. So now I want to say that I don't think that's very interesting anymore. And why not? Because I don't think lectures are a great thing. And I've been doing it, and I'm pretty popular. The course is big. But it's not a great educational medium, as you well know. So I've started to break up the class. I had some great teaching assistants, and we worked on how can we make this course more UDL? Because that's what I really realized, that the first solution you come up with is how to make the lecture more UDL. And we all do that. How do I make my textbook more UDL? How do I make my Blackboard presentation more UDL? But the next step, and that's why I wanted to talk about it here, next step is to think, how do I make the course more UDL? And then I start to think about, well, what are the lectures for? What are they good for? How much should I use them and all that? Rather than how do I fix up lectures? Because they're not necessarily a great medium. They're a terrible medium for lots of people. All my English language learners, all my kids with auditory processing, lots of people, lectures don't work. ADHD people don't like lectures. Okay. So in revising the course, and this is only, we're in our second year now, just finished, we started much more strongly with the UDL approach, which is use a lecture where it's really good and do these things when you do, but what else should we be having people do? And what we decided to do was to really have every day people are making things. They're making a piece of curriculum, they're making something happen that they could use, or at least somebody in their group could use, and that the course was much more not just passive listening to David Rose talk, but to have a very short lecture, often a half an hour, and the class is 3 hours, and the rest of the class was, okay, how do you put that into some kind of practice? How do you do something with that? And come back at the end of our time together and reflect. So we made a much more UDL class. And here's, the key thing that really helped, and so some people are faculty here, I know. I want to say we did one thing that turned out to be really pivotal and learned it over 2 years. And you've all had this experience whether you teach kids or college students. Groups don't work very well, right? You've seen many disasters when you put kids in groups. Often one kid ends up doing it all, and other people are ticked, and they find somebody dominant, and they have fights. And so group projects don't work very well. But we wanted to make groups work because that's the way life is. At CAST, we got to work in groups. In your jobs, teachers are one of the few things you can do a lot of your job all alone, but most people can't. So we wanted to have a successful experience with group projects. So we did two things that I think made a difference. One, we formed the groups at the beginning of the semester, and we told them there would be 4 parts to their final projects. And they needed to think about making sure that someone in their groups could, with the help of the others, do each of these 4 parts. Okay? So the 4 parts were the following. They had to make a UDL lesson of some kind. They could do it on technology, they could do it in some way, but they had to make a good UDL lesson. And and it meant really making it. If you're going to use stuff, you got to have the stuff. If you're going to make it on the web, you got to do it on the web. Got to make it. So you better have someone that has technical ability to do that. Second, you're going to need to sell that curriculum to teachers and students. They need to think. We believe in American culture that you got to. And peacocks do the same. You got to sell a little bit. So they had to make what we called a multimedia brochure, but it could be a video, could be a website, or anything they wanted, that would say what is good about the curriculum that they've made, or the product. A lot of them make products, and one has gone on to be commercial now. But, I lost my thread. Yes, most of them made a video, which is a 2.5, like a YouTube video that says, here's why you should want to do my curriculum. So they had to have a marketer. Third, they had to have a researcher who would, in fact, give all of the evidence from the literature, including the neuroscience literature, for why have they done this? Why have they made these choices about their lesson? They've done this and they need to say why. And that would be a white paper. So I've described 3 things so far. They needed a prototype, something that looks like a product or a lesson. Secondly, a way to advertise it, to sell it at a professional gathering. Thirdly, a white paper, which would look academic and full of references and citations. Okay? And then the 4th thing was an implementation plan. How is this going to actually work in whatever setting you're going to use it? Because what we've learned at CAST, and I know it's something that comes up for all of you, is, well, it's one thing to have this stuff in theory or have some fabulous program, but it's a very different thing to actually make it work in a real classroom. So they had to, in fact, have a 4th part of the project was an implementation plan. How are you going to make it so that it would work in a school? Teachers would know how to use it, principals would support it, parents would be invested in all those things. And so they had 4 different things. And they typically assigned one person to lead in each case. But what it gave was different than most groupings, was that everybody needed to specialize a little bit. Nobody could do all of those. The person who could make an app was not the person who would know how to implement it in schools. The person who had been a teacher or a principal knew how to implement things, and you wanted them on your team in addition to somebody who would know how to make a prototype. And somebody's got to be a researcher, blah, blah. And so what happened is that there was actually a really way for everybody to shine on the teams, instead of, we're all going to do the same thing. In which case you just have one person's really good at it and somebody's sort of good and everybody's ranked. And so what happens is we would get these fabulous videos by people who really knew videos and a white paper by someone who, and so on. But neat, they really had to work together because the white paper had to be talking about the prototype. And the prototype had to illustrate what the researchers were saying, and the marketing thing had to be talking about the real product. And the implementation plan had to implement. So they actually worked together in a way that was collaborative. And it actually was kind of nice. In fact, it was very nice. There was a second thing we did, which you'll think, you don't need to do this in graduate school. But it turned out we did. We needed to scaffold the process. And that's what is really in part of this guideline, is that they were not successful usually at working together. So we made a rubric about how teams work. And we had every 3 weeks, everybody on the team would fill out the rubric about how is your team working. And then we'd make them talk to each other, because a lot of times they wouldn't talk to each other. They'd be trying to get the work done, or they'd be frightened or whatever. But they would put, my group doesn't listen to me. Number 5, not good. And then they would share them. And people for the first time would see that there's someone in their group that does not feel anybody's listening to them. And another one would be something like, one person seems to dominate our discussions. And people would go, oh, the only person that didn't put that down is me. And they had we gave them class time to frankly look at how are they working as a group. And you know what? It made a huge difference. Instead of ending up at the end of the semester with broken products and broken teams, every 3 weeks, they would kind of restart and go, okay, we can do this better. What we're going to do is we're going to have Billy, why don't you start, but then Sally will kind of organize, whatever. They organize themselves. But without getting the feedback, a social feedback, those projects wouldn't have worked. Anyway, so those are 2 things that really made the course, for me, feel more UDL. One is we had multiple means of expression. It wasn't everybody writes a white paper, but a lot of ways to express yourself about what you know. And we scaffolded everybody in learning how to work together, even though they're graduate students at Harvard. And actually, for some people, it was I've gotten letters back each of the last 2 years, some people saying the most valuable thing in the course was learning what I'm really like in a group, because they never heard it from anybody before, and this time they really heard it. And we kept, by the way, the rubrics. We collected them so that they were all filled out, so we knew what was happening too. Okay, I went on too long, probably that. I'm going to do one more now, and then we'll take our break. Okay, so reminding where we are, that was, where's my little clicker? Options for expression and communication. gave them options in the way they could express that they were learning UDL, some through video, some through text, some through da-da-da. And one of them here talks about making sure that we provide scaffolding for people that are not very good at things. And even in group process, we had to scaffold. Okay. Last one before break. Tim Berners-Lee. How many people have heard of Tim Berners-Lee? Okay. You have all used something Tim Berners-Lee made, every one of you. Tim Berners-Lee is the inventor of the World Wide Web. He made the web when he was in the physics lab in Switzerland. And you think, who would have made the web? Tim Berners-Lee made the web. And what's interesting about Tim, and this is another personal story, Tim is actually a friend of mine. We're in a men's group together, which is another educational experience. And Tim is the most ADHD person that I personally know. He is unbelievable. Even in men's group, where the content is pretty lowbrow, when Tim starts a sentence, he launches the sentence, and you can see where he's headed, sort of. But Tim gets bored right in the middle of his own sentence. You know, you can see where it's going, and it's like, oh, forget it. So he doesn't even finish. He goes on to a new sentence. So if you're trying to listen to Tim Berners-Lee, you are having to do extra work to try to figure out, okay, I see where he was going. Now what is he on now? And you're just like so hard to follow him. And when he gives big speeches, which he does, he's a knight of the British Empire. He's a MacArthur Genius Fellow now. He has to give speeches. And they ask him to write them out, because if he doesn't write out his speeches, it's just like horrible. You know, we can understand what's going on. So it's a scaffold for him. But anyway, so Tim, how did Tim invent the web? Because he's ADHD. He couldn't stand it that it took so long for him to get papers from other colleagues. He's doing these big physics experiments that has hundreds of scientists. And he's like, oh my God, I can't send letters and ask for papers. It takes forever. He's impulsive. So he tried to figure out, what could I do so I can get everybody's paper when I want it and find everything I want, all the research. And he came up with this term, which you now know as, what's the URL? You know what URL stands for? Universal Resource Locator. Tim Berners-Lee made the URL for everything. He said, I want to be able to find everything right now when I want it. I want a universal resource locator. I don't want to have to go to the library in Berkeley one day and go over to something else. I want a universal, I want to be able to find everything. And everybody else would have thought that was nuts. Okay, you have to be ADHD to think that's a good idea. So he made a universal resource locator, which you now all use. What I think is a great story, though, is that Tim has changed the face of scholarship, changed the face of marketing, changed all sorts of things because of the way the web works, and everything is connected to everything else. But it's not all good. And what is, I think, funny is that he's made you all feel like you have ADHD when you're on the web. Now, don't you feel like it? When you're on the web, you cannot read an 8-page article. You just can't do it because you get distracted. You're impulsive. You are Tim Berners-Lee when you're on the web. He never thought you'd be reading long things. He thought, you know, hey, nobody reads anything long because he doesn't. But at any rate, when you're on the web, he's made an environment which works, but you are just not skilled at using it yet, so you get distracted. You are not a good reader on the web. Tim is excellent. So he's made the whole world be ADHD now. And I thought I'd show you a favorite app that I found. This one is called Self-Control. Look at the symbol for it. Self-Control, a free Mac application to help you avoid distracting websites. Now, you're all going to want to use this. It's just an app that you put on your iPad, and you just say, for the next, and it literally, you have to put in much time, for the next half hour, I don't want Facebook to signal me, and I don't want to get any tweets. You just go down and clicks it and says, okay, I don't want to be distracted because there's just too much. So you tell it that, and you know what's great? You can't override it. You put in, okay, I really want to get this essay done in the next half hour, so you just click your thing that says, no interruptions. So nobody can get to you on the web. It's fabulous, and you can be selective. So if your mother calls, you can say, accept my mother's call. But mostly, you block out everything. And it's great because you can't override it. You can't, because you know you have no self-control. After 5 minutes, you say, well, maybe I would just check my Facebook for a second. You're all like that. But in fact, this is a piece of prefrontal cortex that you buy. And it says, okay, you're not going to be able to do it on your own, so pay, now that they charge money, but you pay $9.95, and you have a little prefrontal cortex for self-control. So Tim Berners-Lee has made it so we all need self-control externally on the web. Great device. Okay, perfect time for a break so that you don't all get too ADHD. I have 3 more stories and a kind of what does the future look like. But take a break, but I fairly short, like 7 minutes, okay? I didn't get to make the point I want to make about Tim Berners-Lee, which is that the alternative to the World Wide Web could have been that we drugged Tim Berners-Lee for his ADHD, when you think of it, okay? Just think if his teachers had said, we need him on drugs and in a behavior control program. So I wanted to make the point that we often, when we fail to take individual differences into account and see them primarily as problem behaviors like Tim's, that we narrow our society and our culture. And a UDL approach actually, at its fundamental, assumes that people are really different and that there's something about Tim Berners-Lee that we don't want to drug, that we want to capture and expand rather than diminish. And there's countless examples of that, as you know. Sometimes the hardest thing for people who are called disabled is to get out of school, because they can do fine if they can get away from the narrow confines of opportunities that we have in schools. There's many of them. George Lucas is my favorite, just terrible in school and couldn't write. He's dyslexic. So nobody thought he could tell stories, and he's like one of the great storytellers of our time, but he needed a different medium. And should be a crime that he had such an awful time in school and no one noticed that he was really a fabulous storyteller, just that he couldn't do it with text. Okay, so now my favorite 3, all right? So this topic is starving B.F. Skinner's pigeons. So something not many people know about me, and I only bring it out occasionally when it serves my purpose. But I was actually Skinner's last undergraduate student. It was a long time ago. And I think he still taught, right? And everybody, there was a time when he was the most dominant learning theorist in the world. And that happened to be the time I was an undergrad. So he was like totally famous. And I was finishing up my undergrad and was interested in education, for which Harvard had no preparation. But someone said, B.F. Skinner is writing a book about education. Why don't you go talk to him? So I went and talked to him. And I ended up going around to schools and institutions with B.F. Skinner. And I'll tell you, that is a great calling card. When you show up anywhere back in that era and say, I'm with B.F. Skinner and we'd like to come and look at your school, you can go anywhere. It was fabulous. And he got me, if we run out of stories, he played a pivotal role in me marrying my wife, which is really an odd story. But anyway, so B.F. Skinner was my sort of senior mentor. But I'm not a Skinnerian at all. I have fallen away dramatically from all that. And so I wanted to tell you that story. I think Skinner was actually quite incorrect about many of the things. And not about what pigeons do under the circumstance he did. That was very clear what pigeons do. But I want to tell you the critical fact that is often not what people notice, because it was my job. See all these pigeons? That is B.F. Skinner. You see all the pigeons behind him? See those cages? So there'd be a huge room with all the pigeons we were running in the labs in little cages like that. And you see those little cups? That would be carefully measured food. And my job was to keep those pigeons at 80% of their normal body weight. Okay? So think what that does. Those are not happy-go-lucky birdies in those cages. Think of you at 80%, someone forced dieted you to 80% of your present weight very rapidly. That's what all of the pigeons in all those experiments are. In fact, if you look up any of the learning theory experiments and under subjects, it'll say, all of the Skinner stuff will say male white Carnot pigeons, Carnot's the kind of pigeon, at 80% body weight. Because that's the first thing you did. You starved them. And because I was the lowest in the totem pole, my job was to starve them. Now, if you don't starve them, you know what pigeons do? They're like junior high kids. They're like cooing at each other and pecking and doing all sorts of things. They're quite unruly. So if you want to teach them to peck at those keys and do all that stuff, you got to get their attention. So how you get their attention is you starve them, and then food gets really important. But under normal circumstances, you know, it works sort of good, but really it's quite mixed. And when I was doing my senior thesis, I could see that my pigeons actually really liked looking at the other pigeons after they had fed. They had to get fed first. But then they were like social, you know, like, hey, get away from this whole thing. And it stuck with me that, in fact, the reason we had their attention was that we starved them. Now, in school, we don't get to starve our kids. Now, I want to say it would work. If you wanted to get your kids' attention, you can do it. You can reduce them, force them to not eat till you get them down to 80% of their body weight, and you give them M&Ms when they do the right answers. You'll have their attention, okay? And there's other things, you know, electroshock, there's all sorts of things that could work. But the problem with all of those is that this whole edifice was not really a learning theory. It was really a motivational theory. It was about how do you motivate people to do what you want them to do, in this case pigeons, same with rats. And you can get complete control of animals by doing draconian things to them. But we can't do those to kids. And I have come to much more to the belief that our job is not to get perfect attention from kids who are under our full control. What we want, and that's why the guidelines are written the way they are, is we want kids who are self-regulating, who make good choices, who are able to set goals for themselves, to want to achieve and things like that. We don't want them starving and looking for the next M&M, because it's not a good prospect for our culture. Turns out to be a bad culture that we'd be training. And at CAST we had a wonderful clinician who worked with very severely disabled kids, for example, kids with autism and mental retardation and so on. It was still called mental retardation then. And she had been a strict learning theorist by training as well. And when she gave her final talk at CAST, she gave this wonderful talk about how she really connected with a kid with autism through his favorite thing. He had a horn that was his object. And most people spent their time trying to figure out how to get the toy away from him. And she went the opposite direction. How am I going to use that toy to get to him so that we can do some other stuff? And it's too long a story, but she began this wonderful intervention where this toy horn became part of almost everything they did, because that was his talisman, his thing he held on to. And instead of trying to fix him in that way, she used it as his window to a wider world. And I think it's a better approach, truthfully. The danger of a strict learning theory approach, which is not, I think, compatible with the UDL approach, is that we assume other people are going to be in control of you in various ways, and that their job is to control the environment or to control you. And it's not a good view of what we want schools to do. We do want kids who can make good choices, who face good choices, who make mistakes and learn from them, all sorts of things. We don't want them under perfect control, because society's not going to be like that. So we need to look at things more like that clinician did, which find out what is this kid's interest? How can I use that interest to build cognition, to build language, to build from there, rather than how can I suppress their interests? How can I starve them? Okay? I've never told that story, actually. Anyway, that principle and guideline is under engagement, provide options for recruiting interest. Now, I will say, by the way, there's some good stuff about motivationally about operant conditioning and stuff. There's some good stuff to know how to do. I don't want to debunk the whole thing because it's very useful. But you have to be very careful that you are not doing it in a way that prevents a child from learning to grow. Okay. Next one, provide options for sustaining effort and persistence. And this one is a story that I have told before, but look, it'd be new to some of you, which is my journey as a trumpet player. And it relates to Benjamin Bloom. I think some of you have heard of Benjamin Bloom, who's most famous for the taxonomy of learning objectives, a very famous, forget whether he was an educational psychologist type that set up what should education be focused on, and actually Common Core adapted from Benjamin Bloom to some extent, quite a while ago. So I just want to, oh, extra S in lessons there. Don't even think about it. So my trumpet playing. When I was in 4th grade, my parents felt music lessons. Let's do music lessons for little Davy. And we lived in a very small town, and there was a piano teacher, and that's it. There wasn't any school bands or anything like that. So they sent me off to the piano teacher, and I, for some reason, who will know, I wanted to play the trumpet. But my family couldn't afford a trumpet, and there wasn't anybody to teach, so my mother said, who was a great teacher, by the way, my mother said, well, we'll buy you a trumpet. Why don't you take it with you when you go to your piano lessons, and she can teach you the trumpet too. Good, provide choices. I mean, it was just exactly the previous guideline is provide choices. If you have no choices, people don't learn anything. So she said, take the piano and your trumpet. Now, what they bought was a little plastic thing. It wasn't even a real trumpet. It was just a plastic trumpet that had 4 things you pressed. So it had almost no similarity to a real trumpet, except it looked like it. It was plastic. So I took it. I didn't know the difference. And my piano teacher, of course, must have been aghast. Can you imagine? Comes in and my mother says, now teach Davy the trumpet, wink, wink, while you're teaching him the piano. So she did her job. So every lesson, the last 10 minutes, I would play this plastic thing. And the poor lady, God knows what she thought was happening. But anyway, after 3 or 4 months, I just wouldn't give it up. I still wanted to play the trumpet. And luckily, my mother, a good teacher, realized, you know what? We're interested in David learning music, not the piano per se. So we need to think UDL. Of course, there was no UDL then, but we need to think about, if we want to get him to be a musician, maybe the trumpet's a more likely route. So they decided they got me a used trumpet, a real trumpet, and then I had to go to the next town to find a trumpet teacher. But that teacher actually did the right thing, which is to say she never denigrated my interest in it. She was incredibly supportive, and my mother was incredibly supportive. This is great. Oh, that sounds so good, and stuff like that. And what Bloom talks about is that everybody, to get real talent at something, to become an expert at something, you need 3 different kinds of teachers along the way. So I'm going to use my own to give you those 3. The first teacher must be largely about the emotion of it all. It is to help you understand that this could be a good thing, this could be fun, that you could enjoy music, that you could feel good while you're making music, that music itself is valuable, all of that. That's what a first teacher needs to do, is to teach you the emotion of music. Music is fabulous. And not turn you off by saying you're terrible at your scales or something, okay? First, get the emotion right. And it's no mistake that for our early grades, we have teachers who are very good at emotional work. Because we know it's so key in the early grades. We've got to have kids who begin schooling with a positive view of schooling. Okay, so anyway, they did their job. I felt like music. I wanted to play the trumpet, I wanted music. So we moved to a town that actually not because of this, but later, we moved to a town that had a band, and that is a junior high band. And I just want to point out, if you follow on your sheets, the first thing that the teacher is recruiting my interest, but now my interest in music has been recruited, but how do you go through that awful long practicing? Because in fact, to get really good at something, you have to do hard work. It's not like it's easy. It's not like you just kind of, you just have to like it. Okay, well, you'll be great. No, you have to practice. You have to do hard work. And so in the guidelines, we talk about, well, what are the options you have for helping kids to sustain effort and persistence? And they're going to be different for different kids, but you need help. It's just not going to be automatic, because that's hard. So I'm not going to go through them all, obviously, but one of them is foster collaboration and community. And that's what bands do. So people join bands because you're going to have to practice a lot, but it's fun to be in a band. And your colleagues are practicing, your friends are playing, and you practice together and all that. So that's a social support for sustaining effort, and it works really well. And what I did in my Harvard class that I just talked about is building community around their projects to help sustain the effort. Okay, but you need to do things to sustain that effort. One of them that you're very familiar with, or maybe familiar with, hopefully, is this last one: increase mastery-oriented feedback. It's one of the ways you sustain kids' effort. Mastery-oriented feedback. Not saying, oh, you're so smart, but saying, wow, you've been working hard and I can see you're getting better. Rewarding the effort. Rewarding the fact that, and helping kids know that things are hard and they take work, and that you can see that they're making progress. So Carol Dweck's work, I think, is getting very famous, rightly so, because she talks about how powerful it is to give the right kind of feedback. But the role of that mastery-oriented feedback, that is feedback about mastery, not about intelligence. Don't say to kids, you're smart. That doesn't help anybody do anything. But mastery-oriented feedback, you are getting better, and here's how I see you're getting better. Feedback, that is part of sustaining kids in effort and persistence, because kids begin to internalize that and be able to start to be able to say those things themselves. So I practiced a lot, and I had lots of support for practicing, and I got to be a really good trumpet player. And we moved to a much bigger city, Miami, Florida, actually. And in high school, as a junior, I was the best trumpet player in our high school. And we went to a contest. And at the contest, we lost. But much worse for me was in the judges' notes, they specifically said that the weakness, they listed weaknesses, the weakness was the solo trumpet, which was me, was weak. So you can imagine what that feels like as a ninth grader. Imagine what that feels like when in front of all your friends you're called out as being the weak link in the band. And that was devastating. So my band leader, though, was a good teacher, and he had been my trumpet teacher up to that point. So he says, let's talk to the judge, which is the right thing to do. Let's talk to the judge, see what he meant. So we made an appointment, we talked to the judge, and he says, oh yeah, I remember. And my band leader says, what should we do? And he said, he needs a new teacher. And I'm like, I'm there with my band leader, and I'm like, oh, this is my guy. And the band leader was good enough to say, okay, I get it. And who do we need? And the guy made a couple recommendations. Okay, so I've gone through 2 stages. The first is it's just about the recruiting interest, the emotionality of, I like this. The second is learning to sustain effort and having the supports around to sustain effort. So I want to tell you what the third teacher is now. This is really different. So now I have to go several towns over to get this expert teacher. And I come in and he says, okay, play me something. So I take out my best piece and I play it for him. I thought I played it pretty well. And I remember every word he said, when I finished, he said, do you play anything well? That was his first comment. So you go, okay, this is far different than that piano teacher or my band leader. the first introduction is, you're crappy. You go, holy cow, I'm not in Kansas anymore. And he says, I don't know. I don't know whether I can take you. In other words, I don't know if I can bother with someone as bad as you. He said, but if you go away for a couple weeks, practice it up, come back, and if you can play it twice as fast and twice as musical, I'll think about taking you. I'm like, holy cow, I was playing as fast as I could. So anyway, I went home that night. I was angry. It was just like when I told you I was angry. I wanted to come back and fire the racist, awful head of department. I was angry. So I practiced for an hour. Up to that time, I'd been practicing half an hour a night, which I thought was pretty good, like most of my peers. Practiced for an hour. The next night, I practiced for 2 hours. Third night, I practiced 3 hours, which is actually what you need to do to get to be a really good trumpet player. But I'd never had that goal before, and I'd never, had the time or whatever, but I was angry enough, and I practiced like crazy for 2 weeks, and then we went back. And I played the piece, and I had a metronome, and I was dead sure I was going to play it twice as fast, and I did. And playing it fast is hard. So I played it twice as fast. It was certainly not twice as musical, but I didn't know how to do that. But anyway, so he listened to it, and he said, okay, I'll take you. But it was like that. He didn't say, that's great, oh, you're good, or anything. It was just, okay, I'll take you. It was sort of like a sop, okay, well, just pay me the money, will you? And it was just like, and actually, I don't remember him ever saying anything good about my trumpet playing for the next, 3 years. And Bloom talks about this. The third teacher to get to really high levels of talent is a tyrant. And you're thinking, wow, I didn't know teachers should be tyrants. But it only can come at the end of a journey where you need someone to say, I see there's talent in you, and you're not getting it yet. And the music is the most important thing, and you're not a musician yet. You're not playing Mozart, you're just playing David. And you need somebody at that last stage to say, I have higher standards, and I'm going to hold you to them. And it was bracing, but I practiced for 3 years. I didn't practice 3 hours every night, but I practiced an hour to an hour and a half every night for the next 3 years. And I got to be a really good trumpet player. And I needed that talent. Now, the reason I wanted to bring up this story was it made me a better trumpet player, but that one of the things that kids with special needs don't get is a tyrant. That is, they often get the dumbing down the curriculum and, oh, that's okay, that's pretty good. And that our job as teachers is to find out something that kid can do around which you'll say, that is not good enough. You can do better than that, and I'm going to require it. Every kid needs to know that we believe in them enough to say you're lousy. I know it's probably not the way to say it. But that you're going to be a tyrant about something. You can't be a tyrant about everything. You can't be a tyrant about decoding for a kid who's dyslexic. But you can find something, and we need to. Because kids need to become really good at something, or they start to feel not good about themselves. Nobody really challenges them. Nobody cares enough to work that hard. So anyway, when you're teaching, one of our jobs is to discover what is the thing that this kid needs a tyrant about. Or maybe you're starting a little lower than that with the practice stuff. How can I help them practice to get pretty good at it so I can then become a tyrant? We need to not lower our standards, and that goes back to that Boston English story. If you have low expectations for your students, they'll fulfill them. Okay, last story. I'm doing okay on time. I had no idea whether this talk would be like 15 minutes or 8 hours, so I'm close. Okay, the last of the guidelines is provide options for self-regulation. And this, again, is to create students who are not Skinner's pigeons, but are regulating their own learning. They're in charge of themselves. They know what to do when they're frustrated. They know how to set goals for themselves that are appropriate. They know how to live their lives in constructive ways. This is what we need to get to. So I want to tell you about, I actually taught Head Start. I know that will seem unlikely. And I was the only male teacher in the Head Start program. So whoever was the administrator, probably thinking it was the best idea, gave me a ton of little boys so that I could be, a role model or something. But of course I was, brand new as a Head Start teacher. I hardly knew what I was doing. It was a terrible idea. I recruited somebody's mother to come in and help me because I could see, I don't know what I'm doing. But at any rate, I was a boy. So I had 20 boys and 8 girls or something like that. It was ridiculous. And 2 of them were not toilet trained. I mean, it was a hardcore Head Start. Anyway, it was hard work. And I ended up, Head Start, I think it only lasted, doesn't it only last a morning? It's not all day. But I would have to go home and just defensively, as some of you do, have to think of a million lessons because half of them wouldn't work, and I had to have different lessons for different kids and everything. And so I was working, easy 16-hour days, just to keep alive, and and just not feel awful. And oh yeah, I've never told this. I had 2 teenagers assigned as teachers' aides, and they were both incarcerated youth who were on work-study program, and they would just go out and smoke dope while I was teaching. It was like, so this was not helping. Anyway, so the mother was good, luckily, because she knew about toilet training and everything. So, and she was actually a really good person. Anyway, at the end of the, this was a summer program. At the end of the summer, I was hospitalized. I literally went, I can't remember, it was the next day or whatever. I was taken to the hospital, or my wife drove me to the hospital, because I was really in bad shape. And we didn't know what I was sick of. And so they did all the tests. And the doctor comes in and he says, "You don't have anything, but your body is wasted. What have you been doing?" And I said, "Teaching Head Start." It was like a good joke line. But it was the hardest job I'd ever done, and I was exhausted. And that's what he said. Your body is exhausted. You are just depleted. You are just have no, you're just going to catch everything. You just have no immunity left. You're in bad shape. Luckily, the term is over. I wanted to end with this one of the 9, because in many ways it's the most important, which is a couple of points. First, I want to stress that teaching is, at its base, emotional work. All 3 of these teachers are at their heart, building an emotional strength at the start, recruiting interest emotionally, building the emotional supports for heavy-duty practice and building skills, and building self-regulation. This is all emotional work. And good teachers do primarily emotional work. And you know this, when you see movies by Disney or anybody about great teaching movies, they don't show somebody's got this fabulous new technique for long division. That's not what does it, or not even a good reading method. They are all about how did that teacher motivate their students to become great? That's what makes a great teacher. It's emotional work. But what we've learned from the neuroscience is emotional work is very depleting for your nervous system. Emotional work is hard work. Teaching kids long division is not hard work. Teaching them to regulate themselves, to feel okay, to overcome adversities, means that you have to live that with them. You have to actually empathize with your kids and understand, this is hard. I know this is hard. I know your parents separated last night. That's the most important thing. I don't give a crap about the long division today. I've got to get you in a good place. That emotional work we have seen in the neurosciences. Remember when I showed you all that the running simulations when you're reading? A good teacher is running simulations on all their kids, and they're running emotional simulations to know, what is this kid feeling right now, and how do I get them in a good place for learning? Bad teachers don't do that, by the way. Bad teaching is very easy. I think it's one of the easiest jobs if you're a bad teacher. You just come in, you have people correct their papers, you go home. But real teaching is emotional work, and it's draining. You know what it's like? In fact, the studies have been done on this. Who else does emotional work are psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers. And you know what they get? They get huge breaks. Psychologists see 20 hours of patients in a 40-hour week. You don't see them 8 hours a day, because emotional work is hard work. Psychiatrists take most of their summer on Nantucket. They're all there. because it's hard to do emotional work. And what they've done is looked at the physiology and show that you are going through the pain your patient is feeling. If you're good at it, you are empathizing and your body is running a simulation and you are feeling, oh my God, I know how you feel. Bad psychologists don't do that. They just say, okay, take 3 aspirin or whatever it is. They can survive, they can do 8 hours a day, no problem. But good ones are running simulations and it's exhausting. So you, as good teachers, are in very exhausting work. And what I wanted to give the lesson of emotional work was that at that age, I didn't know how to self-regulate. I didn't know how to take care of myself. That I burned myself out and wasn't good for my kids or for me. And that teachers need to model self-regulation. To say, this is what I do when I feel overwhelmed. This is what I do when I feel I'm working too hard. This is how I take care of myself. All of those things. So I was a failure of self-regulation, and it wasn't good for my kids or for me. We need to teach kids how to do that, and we do that best by modeling it ourselves. I know how to take care of myself. I know how to do emotional work and take care of myself. Okay. So as I see it, I have 4 minutes left. Where's Liz? Liz, you can't leave when I'm talking. She has.
She's on a phone call.
Oh, she's on a phone call. Okay. I know what I want to do then. I want to end with just a fun thing. These are other things I could have done. I wasn't sure if it only ran for 15 minutes, I needed to have some extra things. So I want to end with one of my favorite videos. I have played this before, some of you have seen this, but this is from Glee. I have to say I've learned a lot by watching Glee. Glee treats students with disabilities better than most schools does. I mean, and by the way, some of the producers of Glee have kids with disabilities, and you can see it in the way they write. It's a both realistic and correct view of how to think about kids with disabilities, and mainly kids with differences. Some of you have heard I have a talk on the web that's called Lady Gaga and Bach. And Lady Gaga's Born This Way is a great UDL anthem. I'm not going to do it here because I've done it a lot. But if you want to hear, go on the YouTube and play the Glee rendition of Born This Way. It's a great UDL anthem because it says, we're all different. And Lady Gaga loves that message, but the producers of Glee love that message. Anyway, so here's just one other episode that was also one of my favorites. So this is, the setup is the following. There's a Glee club from another school. Do you know the premise of Glee? The Glee show is all kids who are not perfect. They all have their own sort of problems, some disabilities, but they're varied. They're not the sort of high school soc types and football heroes. They're kids who, like everybody else, has their problems. And they're joined together by singing, but they are not perfect kids. And that's a real key underlying storyline to the whole of Glee. Anyway, a choir comes to their school from a school for the deaf. And the socias in the school laugh, like, how are kids from a deaf school going to sing? And one of them says, are they going to honk at us? You know, offensive. And so they come and they're going to sing here in the high school gym. And the people that are sitting watching them are the Glee club, not the other kids. And these kids do know what it's like to have a disability, do know what it's like to not be perfect. And so here's their reaction. And by the way, the reason I'm ending with it, because it's so wonderful, they're going to sing John Lennon's Imagine. So I think that's what UDL is about, is we all have something to learn from each other. Anyway, thank you for your attention.